A crown drenched in blood. Alessia DeSantis had never believed in love, not in their world. But when her father was murdered, when she was forced into a marriage that felt more like a prison than a union, she realized something brutal. This was not a wedding. This was a sentence. Marcello Ricci smirked, his fingers ghosting over her pulse. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I've always liked breaking pretty things." Chapter 1. The Scent of Blood and Roses. The air in the cathedral hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blend of incense, lilies, and the metallic tang of fear that clung to Alessia DeSantis like a second skin. Outside, the Roman sun beat down, relentless and unforgiving, but inside, the ancient stones offered only a cold, hollow sanctuary. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, a sea of black suits and veiled faces, all murmuring, judging, waiting for the spectacle, for the union of two families forged not in love, but in blood. Her father's blood. Alessia's fingers, laced tightly within the white kid gloves, trembled almost imperceptibly. The delicate lace of her gown, a masterpiece of Sicilian craftsmanship, felt like a shroud. It was a beautiful cage, crafted to perfection, just as she had been. Groomed, polished, presented as a prize upon. Just weeks ago, this cathedral had echoed with the mournful cries of her father's funeral. Now, it was to be the stage for her own sacrifice. She glanced at the empty space beside her mother, Isabella. The space where her father, Don Antonio DeSantis, should have been. The man who had ruled their lives with an iron fist encased in a velvet glove. A man she had both feared and, in her own way, loved. His absence was a gaping wound, raw and bleeding, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had shattered their world. A betrayal that had led to his brutal murder, orchestrated, she suspected, by the very family she was now being forced to join. Isabella, her face a mask of stoic grief, squeezed Alessia's hand. Her touch, usually so warm and comforting, was cold, brittle. "Stand tall, Alessia," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual lilt. "Show them the DeSantis strength. Show them you are not broken." But Alessia was broken. Inside, she was crumbling, the pieces of her former life scattering like dust in the wind. She had never wanted this life, this gilded cage of the mafia. She had dreamed of escaping, of painting, of living a life free from the suffocating weight of family expectations and the ever-present threat of violence. But those dreams were ashes now, consumed by the flames of her father's death. The organ music swelled, a dramatic prelude to the farce that was about to unfold. The massive doors at the far end of the cathedral creaked open, revealing him. Marcello Ricci, her husband-to-be, her jailer. He moved with a predatory grace, a dark angel descending into the hallowed space. His tailored black suit seemed to absorb the light, making him appear even more imposing. His face, handsome in a harsh, angular way, was set in an expression of cold indifference. Dark eyes, the color of obsidian, scanned the crowd, settling on her with a possessive gleam that sent a shiver of dread down her spine. He wasn't looking at a bride, he was looking at a conquest. Alessia had met him only twice before, brief, formal encounters orchestrated by their fathers. She remembered his cruel smile, the way his eyes had lingered on her, assessing, dissecting. She remembered the chilling whisper he had breathed in her ear during their last meeting. "You will be mine, Alessia, body and soul." Now, as he approached the altar, that whisper echoed in her mind, a prophecy of doom. He stopped before her, his presence radiating a dangerous energy that made the air crackle. He didn't offer her his arm, didn't offer a reassuring smile. Instead, he simply stared, his gaze a silent challenge. The priest, a frail, nervous man who seemed to shrink under Marcello's gaze, began the ceremony. His words, meant to be sacred, felt hollow, meaningless. Alessia's mind drifted, replaying the last conversation she had with her father. "Alessia, mia figlia, you are the key," he had said, his voice weak, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. "You are the future of our family." You must be strong, even when you feel weak. You must be cunning, even when you want to scream. You must survive, even when you want to die. Survival. That was all that mattered now. She had to survive this marriage, this forced union with the man who likely had a hand in her father's death. She had to survive to uncover the truth, to avenge him, to reclaim her life. The priest droned on, his voice barely audible above the roaring in Alessia's ears. She felt a hand, large and possessive, slip into hers. Marcello's hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but she knew it was a deception, a carefully crafted illusion. Do you, Alessia DeSantis, take this man? The words caught in her throat. She looked at Marcello, his dark eyes boring into hers, daring her to refuse. She saw the glint of triumph in their depths, the smug satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. But beneath the fear, beneath the despair, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She was a DeSantis. She would not be broken. She would not be silenced. She would play the game, she would wear the mask, and she would find a way to turn the tables. Her voice, though trembling, was clear and resolute. I do. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, a vow made in chains, a promise whispered to the devil himself. As Marcello slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, a symbol of ownership rather than love, she felt a single tear escape, tracing a hot path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of rage. A silent promise of vengeance. The scent of blood, her father's, mingled with the cloying sweetness of the roses that adorned the altar, a chilling reminder of the price of her gilded cage. And in that moment, Alessia knew that her life, as she had known it, was over. But a new one was beginning. A life of shadows and secrets, of danger and deception. A life where she would have to learn to fight, to survive, and perhaps even to conquer. The game had begun. Chapter 2. A Cage of Gilded Promises. The reception was a grotesque parody of celebration. Held in the sprawling gardens of the Ricci estate, a palatial villa overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, it was an ostentatious display of wealth and power. Chandeliers glittered like captured stars, casting an ethereal glow on the meticulously manicured lawns. Tables laden with delicacies groaned under the weight of silver platters and crystal goblets. Laughter, forced and brittle, echoed through the warm night air, mingling with the mournful strains of a string quartet. Alessia, still trapped in her bridal shroud, felt like a ghost haunting her own wedding feast. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, her smile fixed, her eyes carefully averted from the probing gazes of the guests. Each congratulatory remark, each well-wishing toast, felt like a fresh cut, a reminder of the life she had lost. Marcello remained by her side, a constant, suffocating presence. His hand rested possessively on the small of her back, a subtle reminder of his ownership. He played the part of the devoted husband with chilling perfection, his dark eyes softening when he looked at her, his voice a low, seductive murmur when he spoke to her in public. But Alessia knew it was all a facade, a carefully constructed performance for the benefit of their audience. She caught snippets of conversations, whispers of alliances and rivalries, of business deals and betrayals. The air was thick with unspoken tensions, with a constant thread of violence lurking beneath the veneer of civility. She saw the wary glances, the carefully guarded words, the subtle power plays that unfolded around her. This was the world she had been thrust into, a world of wolves in sheep's clothing. Isabella, her mother, remained distant, her face a mask of carefully controlled grief. She offered Alessia only perfunctory smiles, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Alessia knew that her mother blamed her, in some way, for her father's death. She had been the price of peace, the sacrifice offered to appease the Ricci family. And Isabella, trapped in her own grief and bitterness, could not forgive her for it. As the evening wore on, Alessia felt a growing sense of claustrophobia. The opulent surroundings, the suffocating attention, the constant pretense it was all too much. She needed to escape, to breathe, to find a moment of solitude. She excused herself, murmuring something about needing a breath of fresh air, and slipped away from the main gathering. She wandered through the manicured gardens, the scent of jasmine and roses heavy in the air. The moon, a silver crescent in the inky sky, cast long, dancing shadows across the lawn. She found a secluded alcove, hidden behind a towering hedge of cypress trees. A small stone bench, worn smooth by time, offered a welcome respite. She sat down, closing her eyes, and took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing of her heart. "Enjoying your freedom, Kara?" The voice, low and laced with sarcasm, startled her. She opened her eyes and saw Marcelo standing before her, his dark figure silhouetted against the moonlight. He had shed his jacket, and his white shirt, open at the collar, revealed a glimpse of the dark hair that dusted his chest. He looked even more dangerous, more untamed, outside the confines of the formal gathering. "I needed some air," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "The air is different out here, isn't it? Less suffocating." He moved closer, his presence filling the small space. "You look beautiful tonight, Alessia. Like a trapped bird in a gilded cage." She refused to be intimidated. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "And you, Marcelo? Do you enjoy trapping birds?" His smile widened. "Only the beautiful ones. The ones with fire in their eyes." He reached out and touched a strand of her hair, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "You have fire, Alessia. I saw it in the cathedral. I saw it when you said those vows." "Those vows were a lie," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "You know it, and I know it." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "Perhaps, but they are binding nonetheless. You are mine now, Alessia, whether you like it or not." "I will never be yours," she whispered, her voice filled with defiance. "You may have bought my hand, but you will never own my soul." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. His scent, a heady mix of expensive cologne and something darker, more primal, filled her senses. "We shall see, Kara. We shall see." He straightened, his eyes still locked on hers. "Come," he said, his voice softening slightly. "It's time to return to our guests. They expect a show of unity, of affection." He offered her his arm, a mocking gesture of chivalry. Alessia hesitated for a moment, then, with a sigh of resignation, she took it. As they walked back towards the glittering lights and the waiting crowd, she knew that the battle had just begun. She was trapped, yes, but she was not defeated. She would find a way to survive, to fight, to reclaim her freedom, even if it meant playing the game, learning the rules, and ultimately breaking them. The gilded promises were a cage, but cages could be broken. She would find the key. She had to. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Shadow of the Dawn. The days that followed the wedding were a blur of strained smiles, forced conversations, and suffocating formality. Alessia found herself trapped in a whirlwind of social engagements, endless dinners and parties hosted by various members of the Ricci family and their associates. Each event was a carefully orchestrated performance, a display of power and influence, a constant reminder of the world she now inhabited. She quickly learned the unspoken rules, the subtle nuances of mafia etiquette. She learned to read the silences, to interpret the veiled threats, to navigate the treacherous currents of family politics. She observed, she listened, she absorbed everything, filing away every piece of information, every whispered secret, like a squirrel hoarding nuts for the winter. Marcelo remained a constant presence, his possessiveness both a comfort and a threat. He was attentive, charming, and utterly ruthless. He treated her with a strange mixture of tenderness and cruelty, showering her with expensive gifts while simultaneously reminding her of her powerlessness. He was a master manipulator, and Alessia knew she had to be constantly on her guard. One evening, after a particularly grueling dinner with Marcelo's uncle, Don Salvatore Ricci, a man whose eyes held the chilling coldness of a viper, Alessia found herself alone in her new bedroom. It was a vast, opulent space, decorated in shades of cream and gold, with a balcony overlooking the sprawling gardens. But despite its beauty, it felt like a prison cell. She changed out of the constricting designer dress she had been forced to wear and slipped into a simple silk robe. She walked out onto the balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief against her skin. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. The scent of the sea mingled with the fragrance of the night-blooming jasmine, creating a bittersweet perfume. She leaned against the railing, her thoughts drifting back to her old life, to her small studio apartment in Trastevere, to the smell of oil paints and turpentine, to the freedom she had once taken for granted. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She couldn't afford to be weak. She had to be strong, for herself and for her father. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned and saw Marcello standing in the doorway, his dark eyes watching her intently. He had changed out of his formal attire and was wearing a pair of dark trousers and a loosely fitting white shirt. He looked less intimidating, more human. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Alessia hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She stepped back inside, and he followed, closing the door behind him. He walked over to the balcony and stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the moonlit landscape. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. "But beauty can be deceiving." Alessia remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't trust him, didn't trust his sudden change in demeanor. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "You're thinking about him, aren't you? Your father." She flinched, surprised by his perceptiveness. "He was my father," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Of course, I'm thinking about him." Marcello nodded. He was a powerful man, Antonio DeSantis. Respected, feared, loved. "And betrayed," Alessia added, her voice filled with bitterness. Marcello's expression darkened. "Betrayal is a part of our world, Alessia. It's a constant threat, a shadow that hangs over everything we do. And you expect me to accept that?" she asked, her voice rising in anger. "You expect me to simply forget that my father was murdered, that his own allies turned against him?" He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. "I expect you to survive, Alessia. To adapt. To learn the rules of the game." "And what are the rules, Marcello?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Tell me. Teach me." He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile. "The first rule is simple. Trust no one. Especially not your family." She stared at him, her mind reeling. His words were a chilling confirmation of her own suspicions. But they also offered a glimmer of hope. If he was willing to share this much, perhaps he wasn't entirely her enemy. Perhaps there was a way to use him, to manipulate him, just as he was trying to manipulate her. "And the second rule?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her ear. "The second rule is even simpler. Always watch your back. Because in this world, even the smallest mistake can be fatal." He straightened, his eyes still locked on hers. "I will protect you, Alessia," he said, his voice low and intense. "As long as you are mine, no one will harm you." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they sent a shiver of dread down her spine. His protection came at a price she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. But for now, she had no choice. She had to play the game, to learn the rules, to survive. And perhaps, in the process, she would find a way to uncover the truth about her father's death and to exact her revenge. The whispers in the shadow of the dawn had opened a door, a crack of light in the darkness. She would follow that light, no matter where it led. Chapter 4. The Serpent's Kiss. The following weeks were a masterclass in deception and double-dealing. Alessia, under Marcello's watchful eye, was immersed in the intricate web of Ricci family affairs. She attended meetings, listened to hushed conversations, and witnessed firsthand the brutal efficiency with which Marcello conducted business. He was a man of contradictions, charming and cruel, generous and ruthless, protective and possessive. She learned to decipher his moods, to anticipate his reactions, to navigate the treacherous currents of his personality. She played the role of the dutiful wife, the compliant bride, while secretly observing, analyzing, and plotting. She was a spy in her own home, a prisoner learning the secrets of her captors. One evening, Marcello announced that they would be attending a private gathering at the villa of Don Carlo Rossi, a powerful and notoriously volatile figure within the Roman underworld. Rossi was an old ally of Marcello's father, but their relationship was strained, marked by a history of distrust and rivalry. "This is important, Alessia," Marcello said, his voice serious. "Rossi is a dangerous man. He's unpredictable, and he has a particular fondness for beautiful women." Alessia understood the unspoken warning. She was to be on her guard, to be charming but not provocative, to avoid drawing Rossi's unwanted attention. The Rossi villa was even more opulent than the Ricci estate, a sprawling complex of marble and gold, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken rivalry between the two families. Alessia could feel the eyes of the guests on her, assessing, judging, speculating. Don Carlo Rossi was a large, imposing man with a booming laugh and a predatory gaze. He greeted Marcello with a hearty embrace, but his eyes lingered on Alessia, his expression a mixture of admiration and lust. "Marcello, my boy, you have chosen well," Rossi said, his voice gravelly. "A beautiful bride, a true prize." Marcello's hand tightened possessively on Alessia's waist. "Alessia is more than just a beautiful face, Don Carlo," he said, his voice laced with a subtle warning. "She is a DeSantis, and she has a sharp mind." Rossi chuckled. "Ah, yes, the DeSantis blood. Strong, fiery, and treacherous." He looked at Alessia, his eyes gleaming. "Tell me, Bella, do you share your father's talents?" Alessia met his gaze unflinchingly. "I share my father's loyalty," she said, her voice steady. "And his determination." Rossi's smile widened. "Good. Loyalty is a valuable commodity in our world, but it can also be a dangerous one." The evening progressed, a tense dance of veiled threats and subtle power plays. Alessia remained by Marcello's side, her senses on high alert. She observed the interactions between the various guests, the whispered conversations, the carefully guarded expressions. She was beginning to understand the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that governed their world. As the night wore on, Rossi's attention towards Alessia became increasingly overt. He complimented her on her dress, her hair, her intelligence. He offered her champagne, his fingers lingering on hers as he handed her the glass. He told her stories of his past exploits, his voice dropping to a low, seductive murmur. Marcello, though outwardly calm, was growing increasingly agitated. Alessia could feel the tension radiating from him, the barely suppressed anger in his eyes. Finally, Rossi leaned in close to Alessia, his breath warm on her ear. "You are wasted on this boy, Bella," he whispered. "You deserve a real man, a man who can appreciate your talents." Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. This was dangerous territory. She had to tread carefully. She smiled, a cool, enigmatic smile. "I am content with my husband, Don Carlo," she said, her voice steady. "He is more than capable of appreciating me." Rossi chuckled. "Perhaps. But I am a generous man, Bella. I am willing to offer you opportunities that Marcello cannot." Alessia knew what he was offering. He was offering her a way out, a chance to escape Marcello's control. But it was a trap, a dangerous game that could have deadly consequences. She met his gaze directly. "I am not for sale, Don Carlo," she said, her voice firm. "My loyalty is not something that can be bought or traded." Rossi's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Alessia saw the true darkness that lurked beneath his charming facade. "Everyone has a price, Bella," he said, his voice cold. "You just haven't found yours yet." Before Alessia could respond, Marcello stepped forward, his expression furious. "Don Carlo," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I believe it's time for us to leave." Rossi looked at Marcello, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and amusement. "As you wish, my boy," he said. But remember, the offer stands. Marcelo didn't reply. He took Alessia's arm, his grip tight, and led her away from the gathering. As they walked towards their car, Alessia could feel the weight of Rossi's gaze on her back. The serpent had offered his kiss, a tempting but deadly proposition. She had refused, for now. But she knew that the game had just become much more dangerous. The line between ally and enemy was blurring, and she was caught in the middle. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Shattered Past. The drive back to the Ricci estate was silent, thick with unspoken tension. Marcelo's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw tight. Alessia sat beside him, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew she had played a dangerous game, and she wasn't sure if she had won or lost. When they arrived, Marcelo slammed the car door shut and stalked towards the villa, his movements stiff with anger. Alessia followed, her steps hesitant. She knew a confrontation was inevitable. He led her to his study, a dimly lit room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large, imposing desk. He turned to face her, his dark eyes blazing with fury. "What were you thinking, Alessia?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea how dangerous Rossi is?" "I was handling it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I told him I wasn't interested."
"Handling it?" he roared.
"You were flirting with him. You were encouraging him."
"I was not,"
she protested. "I was being polite, diplomatic. I was trying to avoid a scene." "Diplomatic?" He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You were playing with fire, Alessia. And you almost got burned." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Rossi is a predator. He sees what he wants, and he takes it. And he wants you." Alessia met his gaze, her chin lifted defiantly.
"He can't have me," she said.
"I belong to you, remember?" His eyes softened slightly, but the anger remained. "You belong to me," he repeated, his voice possessive. "And I will not let anyone take you from me." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. "But you need to be more careful, Alessia. You need to understand the rules of this world. You cannot be naive. You cannot be trusting." "I am not naive," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am learning. I am adapting." "Are you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Or are you simply playing a different game? A game of your own?" His words struck a chord. He was right. She was playing a game, a dangerous game of survival and revenge. But she couldn't tell him that. Not yet. She lowered her gaze, feigning submission. "I am trying to do what you want," she said. "I am trying to be a good wife." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I know you are," he said, his voice softening. "I know you're trying. But this world, it changes people. It corrupts them. I don't want to see that happen to you." His embrace was surprisingly comforting, a haven from the storm that raged around them. Alessia rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel safe, to feel protected.
But the moment didn't last.
The reality of their situation, the darkness that surrounded them, came crashing back. She was still a prisoner, a pawn in a deadly game. And Marcelo, despite his moments of tenderness, was still her captor. She pulled away from him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I need to know the truth, Marcelo," she said. "I need to know what happened to my father." His expression hardened. "That is not your concern, Alessia," he said. "That is a matter for the family." "He was my family," she said, her voice rising in anger. "And I deserve to know who killed him and why." He turned away from her, his back stiff. "Some secrets are best left buried," he said. "Digging them up can be dangerous." "I'm not afraid of danger," she said, her voice firm. "I'm more afraid of living a lie. I'm more afraid of betraying my father's memory by accepting his murder." He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkened window. Then, he turned back to her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and resignation. "Your father was a complicated man, Alessia," he said. He had many enemies. Many people wanted him dead. Including you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He flinched, as if she had struck him. I did not kill your father, he said, his voice tight with emotion. I swear to you, on my mother's grave, I did not kill him. Alessia searched his eyes, trying to discern the truth. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. But she couldn't be sure. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then who did?
She asked. Tell me.
Help me find them. He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head.
I cannot, he said.
It's too dangerous. For both of us. I don't care about the danger, she said. I need justice. I need closure. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Justice is a rare commodity in our world, Alessia, he said. And closure is an illusion. He walked over to the desk and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He offered her one, but she shook her head. I will find out the truth, she said, her voice firm. With or without your help. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. You are a stubborn woman, Alessia DeSantis, he said. Just like your father. And I will not rest until I find his killer, she said. Even if it's the last thing I do. The echoes of her shattered past were a constant reminder. Her father's voice, his final words, his legacy. She would not let it be buried in lies and secrets. She would unearth the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 6. The Price of Silence. The following days were marked by a strained truce between Alessia and Marcello. He remained distant, preoccupied with business, while she continued her own silent investigation, piecing together fragments of information, searching for clues that might lead her to her father's killer. She spent hours in the villa's library, poring over old newspapers, family records, and business documents. She discovered a hidden world of coded messages, secret meetings, and unexplained transactions. She learned about her father's rivals, his allies, his enemies. She began to understand the intricate web of power and corruption that had ultimately led to his downfall. She also discovered something else, something that sent a chill down her spine. She found evidence of a large sum of money that had been transferred from one of her father's accounts to an offshore account just days before his death. The account was registered to a shell corporation, its ownership untraceable. But Alessia had a hunch, a gut feeling, that it was connected to his murder. She knew she needed to find out who controlled that account, who had benefited from her father's death. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone she could trust. And there was only one person who came to mind, her childhood friend, Marco Bellini. Marco was a journalist, a rising star at a prominent Roman newspaper. He was known for his investigative skills, his integrity, and his relentless pursuit of the truth. He was also one of the few people Alessia trusted implicitly. She arranged a secret meeting with Marco at a small, unassuming cafe in Trastevere, the neighborhood where they had both grown up. She chose a table in the back, hidden from prying eyes. When Marco arrived, he greeted her with a warm hug. Alessia, he said, his voice filled with concern. It's good to see you. But you look different. She smiled sadly. I am different, Marco, she said. My life has changed drastically. She told him everything, about her forced marriage, about her suspicions regarding her father's death, about the offshore account. She kept nothing back, pouring out her fears, her doubts, her determination to find justice. Marco listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. This is dangerous, Alessia, he said. You're dealing with powerful people, people who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. I know, she said. But I can't just do nothing. I can't let my father's killer go unpunished.
Marco nodded.
I understand, he said. And I'll help you. I'll do whatever I can to find out who controls that account. He promised to use his contacts, his resources, his investigative skills to uncover the truth. He warned her to be careful, to trust no one, to watch her back. The price of silence in this city is very high, he says, looking intently at her. And some people will pay anything to keep others quiet. As they parted, Alessia felt a renewed sense of hope. She had an ally, someone who believed in her, someone who was willing to fight alongside her. But she also knew that the road ahead would be long and dangerous. She returned to the Ricci villa, her mind filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had taken the first step, set the wheels in motion. But she also knew that she was playing a dangerous game, a game with deadly consequences. That evening, Marcello found her in the library, surrounded by stacks of papers and documents. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing, Alessia?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to be honest, at least partially. "I'm trying to understand my father's business," she said. "I'm trying to understand his life and his death." Marcello's eyes narrowed.
"You should leave that to me," he said.
"It's not your concern." "It is my concern," she said, her voice firm. "He was my father, and I have a right to know what happened to him." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Alessia, you're playing a dangerous game," he said. "You don't understand the risks." "I understand the risks," she said. "But I'm not afraid. I'm more afraid of living a lie." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "You are a stubborn woman, Alessia DeSantis," he said. "Just like your father." "And I will not rest until I find his killer," she repeated, her voice unwavering. She knew the price of silence, and she refused to pay it. The truth was worth fighting for, even if it meant risking everything. Chapter 7. A Dance with the Devil. Days turned into weeks, and Alessia continued her clandestine investigation, aided by Marco's discreet inquiries. She learned to navigate the treacherous waters of the Ricci household, playing the role of the dutiful wife while secretly gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of her father's death. Marcello, increasingly preoccupied with a growing conflict between the Ricci family and a rival clan from Naples, the Camorra, became both more distant and more protective. He sensed Alessia's restlessness, her quiet defiance, and it both intrigued and irritated him. He knew she was hiding something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. One evening, Marcello announced that he was taking Alessia to a charity gala, a lavish affair hosted by one of Rome's most prominent socialites, Contessa Isabella Bellucci. The Contessa was known for her extravagant parties, her influential connections, and her rumored ties to the mafia. "This is an important event, Alessia," Marcello said, his voice serious. "It's a chance to solidify our alliances, to show our strength. And it's an opportunity for you to impress the right people." Alessia understood the unspoken message. She was to be on her best behavior, to charm and disarm, to gather information without drawing suspicion. She was to be his asset, his weapon in the intricate game of mafia politics. The gala was held in a magnificent palazzo overlooking the Roman Forum, its interiors a dazzling display of opulence and extravagance. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, their conversations a mix of social pleasantries and veiled threats. The air was thick with perfume, champagne, and the subtle scent of danger. Alessia, dressed in a stunning emerald green gown that Marcello had chosen for her, felt like a bird in a gilded cage. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her smile fixed, her eyes constantly scanning the room. She observed, she listened, she absorbed everything. She noticed the subtle power plays, the carefully guarded expressions, the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when she approached. She saw the fear in some eyes, the envy in others, the admiration in a few. She was beginning to understand the intricate dynamics of this world, the delicate balance of power and influence. During the evening, she found herself engaged in conversation with several prominent figures, including politicians, businessmen, and even a cardinal. She charmed them with her wit, her intelligence, and her carefully cultivated air of innocence. She gathered snippets of information, filed away names and faces, pieced together the fragments of a larger puzzle. Then she saw him. Don Carlo Rossi. He was standing across the room, his eyes fixed on her, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He looked even more imposing, more dangerous than she remembered. Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. She had avoided him since their encounter at his villa, but she knew that she couldn't avoid him forever. He was a powerful figure, a dangerous enemy, and he had made it clear that he wanted her. He began to make his way towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a panther stalking its prey. Alessia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to be careful, to tread lightly. Just as Rossi reached her, Marcello appeared at her side, his arm possessively encircling her waist. "Don Carlo," he said, his voice cool and polite. "I trust you are enjoying the evening." Rossi's smile widened. "Immensely, Marcello," he said, his eyes still fixed on Alessia. "Especially now that I have the pleasure of seeing your beautiful wife again." "Alessia is quite the attraction," Marcello said, his voice laced with a subtle warning.
"But she is also my wife.
"And I am a very possessive man." Rossi chuckled. "I understand, Marcello," he said. "But admiration is a natural response to beauty. And your wife, she is truly exquisite." He turned to Alessia, his gaze lingering on her. "Tell me, Bella, are you enjoying your new life?" Alessia met his gaze unflinchingly. "I am adapting," she said, her voice steady. "It is different from what I expected." Rossi's smile deepened. "Different, yes," he said. "But also exciting, perhaps?" Alessia knew he was baiting her, trying to provoke a reaction. She refused to give him the satisfaction. "Life is full of surprises, Don Carlo," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "One must learn to adapt to the unexpected." He laughed, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You are a wise woman, Alessia DeSantis," he said. "And a brave one." "I admire that." Before he could say more, Marcello intervened. "Don Carlo, if you'll excuse us," he said, his voice firm. "We have other guests to attend to." He steered Alessia away, his grip tight on her arm. As they walked away, Alessia could feel Rossi's eyes burning into her back. She had danced with the devil again, and she had escaped, for now. But she knew that the game was far from over. The stakes were rising, and the danger was growing. She was walking a tightrope, and one wrong step could send her plunging into the abyss. Chapter 8. Beneath the Mask of Civility. The weeks following the gala were a tense dance of appearances and subterfuge. Alessia continued to play the role of the devoted wife, accompanying Marcello to various social events, business meetings, and family gatherings. She was his showpiece, his asset, a symbol of his power and status. But beneath the surface, she was a spy in enemy territory, gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of her father's murder. Marco, her journalist friend, had made some progress in his investigation. He had managed to trace the offshore account to a network of shell corporations, ultimately leading back to a surprising source, Don Salvatore Ricci, Marcello's uncle. The revelation sent a shockwave through Alessia. Salvatore Ricci, the man who had always treated her with a chilling courtesy, the man who had seemed to be one of her father's closest allies, was now a prime suspect in his murder. She knew she had to be careful. Accusing Salvatore directly would be a dangerous move, one that could have deadly consequences. She needed more evidence, concrete proof that would link him to the crime. She began to observe Salvatore more closely, watching his interactions with Marcello, with other family members, with his associates. She noticed his subtle manipulations, his carefully guarded words, his veiled threats. She saw the coldness in his eyes, the ruthlessness that lurked beneath his mask of civility. One evening, during a family dinner at the Ricci villa, Alessia found herself alone with Salvatore on the terrace. He was smoking a cigar, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the city. "You seem troubled, Cara," he said, his voice smooth and paternal. "Is something bothering you?" Alessia hesitated for a moment, then decided to take a calculated risk. "I've been thinking a lot about my father," she said. "About his death." Salvatore's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. "A tragic loss," he said. "Your father was a good man, a valuable ally." "He was also betrayed," Alessia said, her voice trembling slightly. "Someone he trusted murdered him." Salvatore took a long drag from his cigar, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Betrayal is a part of our world, Alessia," he said. "It is a constant threat." "But it doesn't have to be," she said. "We can choose loyalty. We can choose honor." He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. You are an idealist, Alessia, he said. Just like your father. And idealism can be a dangerous thing.
Perhaps, she said.
But it's better than living a lie. It's better than accepting injustice. He smiled, a cold, humorless smile. You have a strong spirit, Kara, he said. I admire that. But you must also learn to be pragmatic. Sometimes, the truth is best left buried. I disagree, she said, her voice firm. The truth must always come to light, no matter the cost. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he chuckled softly.
You remind me of your father, he said.
He was just as stubborn, just as determined. And look where it got him. His words sent a chill down her spine. It was a veiled threat, a warning to back down, to stop digging. But Alessia refused to be intimidated. I will not stop, she said, her voice unwavering. I will find out who killed my father, and I will make them pay. Salvatore's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Alessia saw the true darkness that lurked beneath his mask of civility. Be careful, Alessia, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Some secrets are best left undisturbed. You wouldn't want to end up like your father. He turned and walked away, leaving Alessia alone on the terrace, her heart pounding in her chest. She had challenged him, defied him, and she knew that she had made an enemy. But she also knew that she was getting closer to the truth. The mask of civility was cracking, revealing the brutal reality beneath. And Alessia was ready to face it, no matter the consequences. The price of silence was too high. She would unearth the truth, even if it meant confronting the devil himself. Chapter 9. The Unveiling of Secrets. Alessia knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing her need for information with the ever-present danger of discovery. She continued her charade, playing the dutiful wife to Marcello while secretly gathering evidence against his uncle, Salvatore. The tension between her and Marcello was growing, a palpable undercurrent of suspicion and mistrust. He sensed her distance, her secrets, and it fueled his possessiveness, his need to control her. One afternoon, Marco contacted Alessia with urgent news. He had found a witness, a former associate of Salvatore Ricci, who had fallen out of favor and was now living in hiding, fearing for his life. The man, known only as Silvio, claimed to have direct knowledge of Salvatore's involvement in Antonio De Santis's murder. Arranging a meeting with Silvio was risky, but Alessia knew it was a chance she had to take. With Marco's help, she arranged a clandestine rendezvous at a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of Rome. The warehouse was dark and damp, smelling of rust and decay. Silvio, a gaunt, nervous man with haunted eyes, was waiting for them, his hand trembling as he lit a cigarette. You are Alessia De Santis? He asked, his voice raspy. Alessia nodded. And you have information about my father's death? Silvio took a deep drag from his cigarette, his gaze darting around the warehouse. I worked for Salvatore Ricci for many years, he said. I was his confidant. I know his secrets. He told Alessia a story of greed, betrayal, and murder. He claimed that Salvatore had orchestrated Antonio De Santis's assassination in order to seize control of his lucrative business interests, particularly a network of smuggling routes that controlled the flow of illicit goods into Italy. Salvatore arranged the hit, Silvio said, his voice shaking. He paid off members of your father's own crew to turn against him. He made it look like a rival gang attack, but it was all him. He provided Alessia with specific details, names, dates, and locations. He described the offshore account, the transfer of funds, the coded messages that had been used to coordinate the assassination. I have proof, Silvio said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small, worn leather-bound notebook. This is Salvatore's ledger. It contains all his transactions, his payments, his secrets. He handed the ledger to Alessia. It was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, a detailed record of Salvatore's criminal activities. Alessia felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of triumph and fear. She had the proof she needed, the evidence that would expose Salvatore and bring him to justice. But she also knew that she was now in even greater danger. Thank you, Silvio, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. You are a brave man. Silvio shook his head. I'm not brave, he said. I'm terrified. Salvatore will kill me if he finds out I talked to you. Marco assured him that they would protect him, that they would get him into witness protection. But Silvio remained skeptical. There's nowhere to hide from Salvatore Ricci, he said. He has eyes and ears everywhere. As they were leaving the warehouse, a sudden noise startled them. A car screeched to a halt outside, its headlights illuminating the entrance. Alessia's heart leaped into her throat. It's them, Silvio whispered, his eyes wide with terror. They found me. Before Alessia or Marco could react, several armed men burst into the warehouse, their weapons drawn. A hail of gunfire erupted, shattering the silence. Marco pushed Alessia behind a stack of crates, shielding her with his body. He drew his own weapon, a small pistol, and returned fire. But they were outnumbered, outgunned. Silvio was hit, his body crumpling to the ground. Marco was wounded, a bullet grazing his arm. Alessia, hidden behind the crates, felt a surge of terror, but also a fierce determination. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let Salvatore get away with murder. She grabbed Marco's pistol, her hand steady despite her fear. She peered around the crates and fired, aiming at the attackers. She hit one, then another. The gunfire continued, a chaotic symphony of violence. Then, suddenly silence. Alessia cautiously emerged from her hiding place, her weapon still raised. The warehouse was littered with bodies, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Marco was alive, but injured. Silvio was dead. And Salvatore's men, they were gone. Alessia knew that she had narrowly escaped death. She had the ledger, the proof she needed, but she was now a target, marked for death. She had unveiled the secrets, and the consequences were immediate and brutal. The game had changed. It was no longer about survival, it was about war. Chapter 10. Scars that never heal. The aftermath of the warehouse ambush was a blur of chaos and fear. Alessia, shaken but determined, managed to get Marco to a safe house, a secluded apartment owned by one of his trusted contacts. She tended to his wound, a superficial graze, but the emotional scars were deeper, etched into both of their minds. Silvio's death weighed heavily on Alessia. She had promised him protection, and she had failed. His sacrifice, however, had given her the ultimate weapon, Salvatore's ledger. It was a damning indictment, a detailed record of his criminal empire, including the evidence that linked him directly to her father's murder. She knew she couldn't go to the police. The Ricci family had influence that stretched far and wide, corrupting law enforcement, judges, and politicians. She had to find another way, a way to expose Salvatore without putting herself and Marco in further danger. She spent hours poring over the ledger, deciphering the coded entries, tracing the flow of money, identifying the key players in Salvatore's network. It was a complex web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and secret transactions. But Alessia was determined to unravel it, to expose the truth to the light. Marcello, meanwhile, was growing increasingly suspicious. He had noticed Alessia's distance, her secrecy, and the warehouse shooting, though reported in the news as a gang-related incident, had raised his alarm bells. He knew she was involved somehow, but he couldn't prove it. He confronted her one evening, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. "What are you hiding, Alessia?" he demanded. "What were you doing at that warehouse?" Alessia met his gaze, her expression carefully guarded. "I told you," she said. "I was meeting with a friend, a journalist. We were discussing my father's business." "Your father's business is my business now," he said, his voice harsh. "And you have no right to interfere." "He was my father," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I have a right to know who killed him." Marcello's eyes narrowed. "You think you know, don't you?" he said. "You think you have proof." Alessia remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, pushing him to the edge. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Tell me, Alessia," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Who do you suspect?" She hesitated for a moment, then lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. Your uncle, she said, her voice firm.
Salvatore Ricci.
Marcello's reaction was immediate and violent. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. You dare accuse my uncle? He roared. You dare accuse my family? He killed my father, she said, her voice unwavering. And I have proof. She showed him the ledger, pointing out the key entries, the coded messages, the damning evidence. Marcello stared at the ledger, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief to a dawning horror. He recognized his uncle's handwriting, the familiar codes, the unmistakable patterns of his criminal transactions. He released Alessia's arm, his grip loosening. He stepped back, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and betrayal. I don't believe it, he whispered. Salvatore, he did, Alessia said, her voice firm. And he will pay for his crimes. Marcello looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the pain, the anger, the determination in her gaze. He saw the truth. He turned away, his shoulders slumping. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. He had always suspected his uncle's ruthlessness, his ambition, but he had never imagined that he would be capable of such a betrayal, such a cold-blooded murder. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I'm going to expose him, Alessia said. I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did. Marcello nodded slowly. And what about me? He asked. What about our marriage? Alessia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. Our marriage was a lie, she said. A forced union, built on blood and betrayal. But it doesn't have to be, he said, his voice pleading. We can start over. We can build something real. Alessia shook her head. I don't know if I can trust you, Marcello, she said. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for being a Ricci. The scars of the past, the wounds of betrayal, were too deep. They could never be fully healed. The truth had been revealed, but the price had been high. And the future was uncertain. Chapter 11. A flicker of defiance. The revelation of Salvatore's treachery had shattered the fragile foundation of Alessia and Marcello's marriage. The carefully constructed facade of unity and affection crumbled, revealing the chasm of distrust and resentment that lay beneath. Marcello, torn between his loyalty to his family and his growing feelings for Alessia, was a man divided. He had lost the comfortable illusion of control, and he was adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. Alessia, despite her own pain and confusion, was resolute. She had the evidence, the means to expose Salvatore, and she would not be deterred. She had Marco working on a plan to leak the information to the press, to create a public outcry that would force the authorities to act. It was a risky gambit, one that could expose them both to danger, but Alessia was willing to take the risk. She knew that Marcello was watching her, waiting for her next move. He had not explicitly agreed to help her, but he had not stopped her either. He was caught in a moral dilemma, torn between his loyalty to his uncle and his sense of justice. One evening, Alessia found Marcello in his study, staring out the window at the darkening sky. He looked weary, defeated, the weight of his family's sins bearing down on him. What are you going to do, Marcello? She asked, her voice soft. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. I don't know, he said. I honestly don't know. You have to choose, she said. You can't stay on the fence. You're either with me, or you're against me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not that simple, Alessia, he said. Salvatore is my uncle. He's family. He's a murderer, she said, her voice firm. He killed my father, and he tried to kill me. Marcello flinched, as if she had struck him. I know, he said. And I'm sorry.
Sorry isn't enough, she said.
I need justice. I need retribution. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the pain, the anger, the unwavering determination in her gaze. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had tried to control, the woman who had defied him at every turn. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Help me, she said. Help me expose him. Help me bring him to justice. He hesitated for a moment, his internal struggle evident in his eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "I will," he said. "I'll help you." It was a flicker of defiance, a spark of rebellion against the ingrained loyalty that had defined his life. He was choosing Alessia, choosing justice over his family, over his own self-preservation. They worked together, secretly, cautiously, planning their next move. Marcello used his inside knowledge of the family's operations to provide Alessia with additional information, to corroborate the evidence in the ledger, to identify key witnesses who could testify against Salvatore. He also took steps to protect her, to shield her from his uncle's reach. He knew that Salvatore would not hesitate to silence her, to eliminate anyone who threatened his power. The tension between them remained, the unspoken resentments and unresolved conflicts simmering beneath the surface. But there was also a new understanding, a shared purpose, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. One evening, as they were working late in the library, poring over documents and maps, Marcello looked at Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and regret.
He said, his voice soft.
"I never wanted this life. I never wanted to be a part of this darkness." Alessia met his gaze, her own eyes softening. "I know," she said. "I see that now. I want it to be different," he said. "I want it to be better."
"It's not too late," she said.
"You can still choose a different path." He smiled sadly.
"Perhaps," he said.
"But the past, it casts a long shadow."
"We can't change the past," she said.
"But we can shape the future." He reached out and touched her hand, his fingers lingering on hers. "Thank you, Alessia," he said, "for showing me that there's another way." It was a moment of connection, a fleeting glimpse of the possibility of redemption. But the danger was still present, the threat of Salvatore's wrath looming over them. They were defying the darkness, but the darkness was not yet defeated. The flicker of defiance was fragile, but it was there. And it gave them hope. Chapter 12. The Lion and the Lamb. The alliance between Alessia and Marcello was a fragile one, built on a foundation of shared purpose and mutual need, but undermined by years of ingrained distrust and the weight of their respective pasts. They worked together, meticulously planning their strategy to expose Salvatore, but the shadow of their forced marriage, the memory of her father's murder, hung over them like a shroud. Marcello, despite his decision to help Alessia, was still a Ricci, bound by the code of loyalty and omerta that had governed his life. He was walking a tightrope, balancing his desire for justice with the potential consequences of betraying his family. He knew that Salvatore would show no mercy, that his wrath would be swift and brutal. Alessia, despite her growing trust in Marcello, could not entirely erase the suspicion that had been ingrained in her. He was her husband, yes, but he was also the nephew of her father's killer. She could not forget that, could not completely dismiss the possibility that he might still be playing a double game. One evening, Marcello arranged a secret meeting with a high-ranking member of the Carabinieri, the Italian military police, a man named Captain Lorenzo Rossi, no relation to Don Carlo Rossi. Rossi was known for his integrity and his unwavering commitment to justice, a rare commodity in the corrupt world of Roman law enforcement. Marcello had known Rossi for years, a relationship built on mutual respect and a shared desire to clean up the city. He trusted Rossi implicitly, and he believed that he was the only person who could help them bring Salvatore to justice. The meeting took place in a secluded villa outside of Rome, a safe house used by the Carabinieri for sensitive operations. Alessia, Marcello, and Marco presented their evidence to Rossi, laying out the details of Salvatore's criminal empire, his involvement in Antonio de Santis's murder, and the proof contained in the ledger. Rossi listened intently, his expression grave. He examined the ledger, reviewed the supporting documents, and questioned Alessia and Marco about their investigation. "This is a very serious matter," he said, his voice firm. "Salvatore Ricci is a powerful man, with connections that reach the highest levels of government." "We know the risks," Captain Alessia said. "But we are determined to see justice done." Rossi nodded. "I believe you," he said. "And I will help you. But we must proceed carefully. We need to build an airtight case, one that cannot be dismissed or corrupted." He outlined a plan to gather additional evidence, to corroborate the information in the ledger, to identify and protect key witnesses. He warned them that it would be a long and dangerous process, that they would face opposition at every turn. Salvatore will not go down without a fight, Rossi said. He will use every weapon at his disposal, including violence, intimidation, and bribery. We are prepared for that, Marcello said, his voice resolute. Rossi looked at Marcello, his eyes searching his. Are you sure about this, Marcello? He asked. This will mean betraying your family, turning against your own blood. Marcello hesitated for a moment, his internal struggle evident. Then, he met Rossi's gaze directly. I am sure, he said. I am doing what is right. Rossi nodded. Then we will proceed, he said. But we must be vigilant. We must trust no one but each other. As they left the meeting, Alessia felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. They had an ally, a powerful ally, in Captain Rossi. But they were also facing a formidable enemy, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his power and his freedom. Marcello, sensing her anxiety, took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. We'll do this together, Alessia, he said. We'll face whatever comes. It was a moment of unity, a shared commitment to their dangerous mission. The lion and the lamb, seemingly incongruous allies, were united against a common enemy. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Alessia felt a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail, that the darkness might be overcome by the light. But the path ahead was fraught with peril, and they would need all their courage, all their cunning, to survive. Chapter 13. Threads of Deceit. The weeks that followed were a tense game of cat and mouse. Alessia, Marcello, Marco, and Captain Rossi worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, building their case against Salvatore Ricci. They moved in the shadows, communicating through encrypted channels, meeting in secret locations, always aware that they were being watched, that one wrong move could expose them. Salvatore, meanwhile, was growing increasingly suspicious. He had sensed Marcello's shift in loyalty, his growing distance, and he knew that Alessia was a threat. He had his men watching them, following their every move, trying to uncover their plans. The tension between Alessia and Marcello, though lessened by their shared purpose, remained. The past was a constant presence, a barrier that prevented them from fully trusting each other. They were allies, yes, but they were also prisoners of their history. One evening, Alessia received a cryptic message from an anonymous source, warning her that Salvatore was planning to strike. The message was brief, vague, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. She showed the message to Marcello, her heart pounding in her chest. What does it mean? She asked. Who sent this? Marcello studied the message, his expression grim. I don't know, he said. But we have to assume it's real. Salvatore is desperate. He'll do anything to stop us. They decided to go into hiding, to disappear from Salvatore's radar. They left the Ricci villa, abandoning their lives of luxury and privilege, and moved into a small, nondescript apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Rome. It was a stark contrast to their previous life, a world away from the opulence and extravagance of the mafia world. But it was also a refuge, a place where they could be themselves, without the constant pressure of appearances and expectations. They continued to work with Captain Rossi, providing him with the information they gathered, helping him to build his case. They lived in constant fear of discovery, always looking over their shoulders, always aware that Salvatore's men could be anywhere. One day, Marco discovered a crucial piece of evidence, a witness who had seen Salvatore meeting with the hitmen who had carried out Antonio DeSantis's murder. The witness, a former member of Salvatore's crew, was willing to testify, but he was terrified, fearing for his life. Arranging a meeting with the witness was risky, but Alessia knew it was a chance they had to take. With Captain Rossi's help, they arranged a clandestine rendezvous at a remote location outside of Rome. The meeting was tense, fraught with danger. The witness, a nervous, jittery man, provided a detailed account of Salvatore's involvement in the murder, confirming the information in the ledger and providing additional, damning details. As they were leaving the meeting, they were ambushed. A hail of gunfire erupted, shattering the silence. Alessia, Marcello, and Marco found themselves pinned down, caught in a deadly crossfire. Marcello, drawing on his years of experience in the mafia underworld, reacted instantly. He pushed Alessia to the ground, shielding her with his body. He returned fire, his aim precise and deadly. Marco was hit, a bullet grazing his shoulder. Alessia, despite her fear, remained calm. She grabbed Marco's weapon and fired back, her hand surprisingly steady. The shootout was brief, but brutal. When it was over, several of Salvatore's men lay dead or wounded. Marcello had taken a bullet to the arm, but he was alive. Marco's wound was superficial. The witness, miraculously, was unharmed. They had survived, but they knew that the danger was far from over. Salvatore had shown his hand, his willingness to kill anyone who stood in his way. He was desperate, and he would stop at nothing to silence them. The threads of deceit were unraveling, revealing the brutal reality of the mafia world. Alessia and Marcello, caught in the crosshairs, had to fight for their lives, for justice, for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The game had escalated, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 14. Where Loyalty Lies. The ambush had shaken them, a stark reminder of the danger they faced. Marcello's wound, though not life-threatening, was a constant reminder of Salvatore's ruthlessness. Alessia tended to him, her touch gentle, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and gratitude. He had saved her life, shielding her from the gunfire, and she knew that she owed him a debt she could never fully repay. They were forced to move again, seeking a new safe house, a new hiding place. Captain Rossi, increasingly concerned for their safety, provided them with a secure location, a remote farmhouse in the Tuscan countryside, far from the prying eyes of Salvatore's network. The farmhouse was a world away from the opulence of the Ricci villa, a simple, rustic dwelling surrounded by rolling hills and vineyards. It was a place of peace, of tranquility, a refuge from the violence and chaos of their lives. But even in this idyllic setting, they could not escape the tension, the constant fear of discovery. They knew that Salvatore would not give up, that he would continue to hunt them, to try to silence them. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset over the Tuscan hills, Marcello spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "Alessia," he said, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming. Do you trust me?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. It was a question that had been hanging between them, unspoken, unresolved. Alessia hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She had seen his bravery, his loyalty, his willingness to risk his life for her. But she also remembered his past, his family, the ingrained code of omerta that had governed his life. I want to trust you, Marcello," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's difficult." He nodded, his expression understanding. "I know," he said. "I understand. I've given you no reason to trust me." "You saved my life," she said. "That's a reason." He smiled sadly. "That doesn't erase the past," he said. "It doesn't change who I am, who I was." "It changes who you can be," she said, her voice firm. "You've chosen a different path, Marcello. You've chosen justice over loyalty to your family." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "But is it enough?" he asked. "Is it enough for you?" Alessia reached out and touched his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "It's a start," she said. "It's a beginning." It was not a declaration of love, not a promise of forever. But it was a step forward, a fragile bridge across the chasm that separated them. The following days were a mixture of quiet intimacy and continued preparation. They worked with Captain Rossi, finalizing their plan to expose Salvatore. They gathered additional evidence, contacted key witnesses, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. One evening, Marco arrived at the farmhouse with news. Captain Rossi had obtained an arrest warrant for Salvatore Ricci. The time had come. Alessia felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and excitement. The moment of truth was at hand. They were going to confront Salvatore, to bring him to justice. Marcelo, sensing her anxiety, took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll do this together, Alessia," he said. "We'll face him together." The question of where loyalty lies had been answered, at least for now. Marcelo had chosen to stand with Alessia, to fight for justice, to betray his own blood. But the battle was far from over. The confrontation with Salvatore would be the ultimate test, a trial by fire that would determine their fate. The farmhouse, their temporary sanctuary, was about to become a battleground. Chapter 15. The Taste of Forbidden Fruit. The plan was set. Captain Rossi, with a heavily armed squad of carabinieri, would raid Salvatore Ricci's villa, arresting him and his key associates. Alessia and Marcelo, despite Rossi's strong objections, insisted on being present. They wanted to witness Salvatore's downfall, to see justice served with their own eyes. It was a dangerous decision, but they were resolute. They arrived at the villa under the cover of darkness, the carabinieri surrounding the perimeter, their weapons drawn. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the distant barking of dogs and the chirping of crickets. Alessia and Marcelo, positioned behind a line of armored vehicles, watched as the carabinieri stormed the villa, their movements swift and precise. Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness of the night. The sounds of shouting, of breaking glass, of struggling bodies, echoed through the air. Alessia's heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. She gripped Marcelo's hand, her fingers digging into his flesh. He squeezed back, his presence a source of strength, of reassurance. The raid was swift and decisive. Salvatore's men, caught off guard, were quickly overwhelmed. The carabinieri, while trained and heavily armed, met little resistance. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the gunfire ceased. Silence descended, broken only by the occasional shout and the crackle of police radios. Captain Rossi emerged from the villa, his face grim. "Salvatore Ricci is in custody," he said, along with several of his key associates. Alessia felt a surge of relief, of triumph, but also of sadness. The battle was won, but the war had taken its toll. Lives had been lost, families shattered, and the scars of the past would never fully heal. They entered the villa, the scene of so many lavish parties, so many whispered secrets, so many acts of treachery. It was now a crime scene, littered with debris, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. They found Salvatore in his study, handcuffed and surrounded by carabinieri. He looked old, defeated, his usual arrogance replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He saw Alessia and Marcelo, his eyes narrowing with hatred. "You," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You betrayed me." Marcelo met his gaze unflinchingly. "You betrayed yourself, Salvatore," he said. "You betrayed the family. You betrayed us." Salvatore laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Loyalty," he sneered. "Honor. Those are just words, Marcelo. Empty words. The only thing that matters is power. And you have thrown it all away." Alessia stepped forward and faced in a moment of confrontation. "You killed my father and thought you could live above consequences," Alessia said, her voice shaking but loud and full of life in the large, imposing room. "But your sins will follow you wherever you go." Salvatore was led away, his head bowed, his empire crumbling around him. Alessia and Marcelo watched him go, their emotions a complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and sorrow. The immediate danger had passed. Salvatore was in custody, his reign of terror at an end. But the future remained uncertain. In an almost deserted backroom of the massive estate, away from prying eyes and listening ears, Alessia and Marcelo stand quietly, both staring out the window, both full of memories and unspoken feelings. They stood in a quiet corner of the villa, watching the dawn break over the Roman skyline. The taste of forbidden fruit. The taste of a love born in darkness, in betrayal, in violence. "What happens now?" Alessia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcelo turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope.
"I don't know," he said.
But we'll face it together. Whatever it is. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of longing, of regret, of a fragile hope for a future they might share. It was a kiss that tasted of forbidden fruit, of a love born in the midst of chaos, of a bond forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, for better or for worse. The battle was over, but their journey was just beginning. Chapter 16. Cracks in the Foundation. The arrest of Salvatore Ricci sent shockwaves through the Roman underworld and beyond. The media, fueled by Marco's carefully orchestrated leaks, feasted on the story, exposing the intricate web of corruption, violence, and betrayal that had defined the Ricci family for decades. The public outcry was deafening, demanding justice, demanding accountability. Alessia and Marcello, though hailed as heroes by some, were also targets of criticism and suspicion. They were caught in the crosshairs of a power struggle, their lives dissected and scrutinized by the media, by law enforcement, by the remnants of Salvatore's shattered empire. They returned to the Ricci villa, but it was no longer a home, no longer a sanctuary. It was a symbol of their past, a reminder of the darkness they had escaped, the price they had paid. The weight of their actions, the consequences of their choices, bore down on them. The legal proceedings against Salvatore were long and complex, a labyrinth of legal maneuvering, witness tampering, and political interference. Captain Rossi, despite facing immense pressure, remained steadfast in his commitment to justice, pursuing the case with relentless determination. Alessia and Marcello, though no longer actively involved in the investigation, were called to testify, to recount their experiences, to provide evidence that would help convict Salvatore. It was a painful process, forcing them to relive the trauma, to confront the ghosts of their past. The strain of the trial, the constant media attention, the ever-present threat of retaliation from Salvatore's loyalists, took its toll on their relationship. The fragile bond they had forged, the tentative trust they had established, began to fray. Marcello, haunted by his family's legacy, by his own complicity in their crimes, struggled to reconcile his past with his present, his desire for redemption with the weight of his guilt. He became withdrawn, distant, his eyes filled with a sadness that Alessia could not reach. Alessia, despite her own pain and exhaustion, tried to support him, to offer him comfort, to remind him of the good they had done, the justice they had achieved. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears, lost in the darkness that consumed him. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the courthouse, Alessia found Marcello in his study, staring out the window at the city lights. He looked lost, defeated, the weight of the world on his shoulders.
"Marcello," she said, her voice soft. "Talk to me, please."
He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and despair. "I don't know who I am anymore, Alessia," he said. "I don't know where I belong." "You belong with me," she said, her voice firm. "We belong together." He shook his head. "I'm a Ricci," he said.
"I'm tainted. I'm cursed." "You're not your family," she said. "You're not your uncle. You chose a different path. You chose justice." "But at what cost?" he asked. "I betrayed my family, my blood. I'm an outcast, a pariah." "You're a hero," she said. "You helped bring down a criminal empire. You saved lives." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Heroes don't feel this way," he said. "Heroes don't feel this empty." Alessia stepped closer, reaching out to touch his hand. He flinched, pulling away from her. "Don't," he said, his voice cold. "Don't touch me." Alessia's heart sank. The cracks in the foundation of their relationship were widening, threatening to swallow them whole. The weight of their past, the burden of their present, was proving too much to bear. The love that had blossomed in the darkness was withering in the harsh light of reality. The trial, the media, the threats, it was all tearing them apart. Chapter 17. A desperate gamble. The growing distance between Alessia and Marcello was a palpable ache, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of their bond. The trial was dragging on,
Salvatore's lawyers employing every tactic to delay, to discredit, to obstruct justice. The pressure was mounting, and the cracks in Alessia and Marcello's relationship were widening into fissures. One evening, Alessia received a disturbing phone call. It was Marco, his voice urgent, panicked. "Alessia, they're trying to frame you," he said. "Salvatore's lawyers, they've fabricated evidence. They're claiming you were involved in your father's murder, that you conspired with Salvatore to seize control of the family business." Alessia's blood ran cold. It was a nightmare scenario, a twisted perversion of the truth. She was being targeted, framed for a crime she had fought so hard to expose. "They have witnesses," Marco continued. "Corrupt cops, paid informants, they're building a case against you." Alessia felt a surge of panic, of desperation. She had to do something, to fight back, to clear her name. She told Marcello, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. He listened, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "They won't get away with this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let them." He knew that he had to act, to protect Alessia, to expose the lies, to save her from being dragged down into the abyss. But he also knew that it was a desperate gamble, a risky maneuver that could have devastating consequences. He contacted Captain Rossi, informing him of the fabricated evidence, the conspiracy to frame Alessia. Rossi, though shocked and outraged, was limited in what he could do. The legal system was corrupt, influenced by Salvatore's money and power. Marcello decided to take matters into his own hands. He used his remaining contacts within the underworld, his knowledge of the family's secrets, to gather information, to uncover the truth behind the fabricated evidence. He discovered that Salvatore's lawyers had paid off several key witnesses, including a corrupt police officer who had been involved in the initial investigation into Antonio DeSantis' murder. He also found evidence of a secret slush fund used to bribe judges, politicians, and journalists. It was a dangerous game, a return to the darkness he had tried to escape. But he was driven by a fierce determination to protect Alessia, to save her from the injustice that threatened to engulf her. He arranged a secret meeting with a corrupt police officer, offering him a choice: confess his involvement in the conspiracy and testify against Salvatore's lawyers, or face the consequences. The officer, terrified of Marcello's reputation, of his ruthlessness, agreed to cooperate. He provided a detailed confession, outlining the plot to frame Alessia, the payments he had received, the names of the individuals involved. Marcello presented the confession to Captain Rossi, along with the evidence of the slush fund. Rossi, armed with this new information, launched a counter-investigation, targeting Salvatore's lawyers and their accomplices. The tables were turning. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Salvatore's desperate gamble to frame Alessia had backfired, exposing his own corruption and further incriminating him. Alessia, though relieved by Marcello's actions, was also terrified. He had risked his life, his freedom, to protect her. He had returned to the darkness, and she feared that he might not be able to find his way back. The gamble had paid off, for now, but the cost was yet to be determined. The foundation of their relationship, already cracked, was being tested to its limits. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. Marcello's actions had a profound impact. The fabricated case against Alessia crumbled, exposed as a desperate attempt by Salvatore's lawyers to derail the trial and secure his release. Several of the lawyers were arrested, charged with obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy. The corrupt police officer, facing a long prison sentence, agreed to testify against Salvatore, providing further damning evidence of his guilt. The tide had turned. Salvatore's defense was in tatters, his power and influence waning. The trial was nearing its conclusion, and the verdict seemed inevitable. Alessia, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief, tried to reach out to Marcello, to thank him for his bravery, for his unwavering support. But he remained distant, withdrawn, his eyes haunted by the darkness he had confronted. She found him one evening in the villa's garden, standing by the fountain, staring at the water. He looked lost, broken, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. "Marcello,"
she said, her voice soft. Thank you. You saved me.
He turned to her, his expression grim. I did what I had to do, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You risked everything for me, she said. You could have been killed. He shrugged.
It was worth it, he said. But why?
She asked. Why did you do it? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. Because I care about you, Alessia, he said, his voice barely a whisper. More than I ever thought possible. It was not a declaration of love, not a passionate confession, but it was a truth, a raw, honest admission of his feelings. Alessia stepped closer, reaching out to touch his hand. He didn't pull away. I care about you too, Marcelo, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm scared.
Of what?
He asked. Of us, she said. Of what we've been through. Of what we might become. He nodded, his expression understanding.
I know, he said.
It's a lot to process. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the gentle splashing of the fountain. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared past, the uncertainty of their future. I don't know what happens now, Alessia said, her voice barely a whisper. Neither do I, he said. But we'll figure it out. Together. It was not a promise, not a guarantee. But it was a hope, a flicker of light in the darkness that had surrounded them. The following day, the jury delivered its verdict. Salvatore Ricci was found guilty on all counts, including the murder of Antonio DeSantis. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice had been served. The long, arduous battle was finally over. Alessia and Marcelo stood in the courtroom, their hands clasped tightly together as the verdict was read. They felt a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and sorrow. The past had been avenged, but the scars remained. As they left the courthouse, they were surrounded by a throng of reporters, their cameras flashing, their questions shouted. They ignored them, walking hand in hand, their faces set, their eyes fixed on the future. The heart's reckoning was complete. They had faced the darkness, confronted their demons, and emerged, scarred but not broken. The future remained uncertain, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they would walk it together, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined. The reckoning had forged a bond, stronger than blood, stronger than betrayal, stronger than fear. Chapter 19. Flames of Rebellion. The aftermath of Salvatore's conviction was a period of quiet reflection and tentative healing. The media frenzy subsided, the public's attention shifted to other dramas, and Alessia and Marcelo were left to grapple with the consequences of their choices, the weight of their shared past. They decided to leave the Ricci villa, the symbol of their former lives, the embodiment of the darkness they had escaped. They moved to a small, secluded apartment in Trastevere, the neighborhood where Alessia had grown up, the place where she had once dreamed of a life free from the mafia's suffocating grip. It was a fresh start, a chance to build a new life, a life based on honesty, trust, and love. But the ghosts of the past were not easily exorcised. The memories of violence, betrayal, and loss lingered, casting a shadow over their present. Marcelo, though relieved that Salvatore was behind bars, struggled with the guilt of betraying his family, the shame of his own complicity in their crimes. He sought therapy, trying to come to terms with his past, to find a path towards redemption. Alessia, though grateful for Marcelo's support, for his unwavering loyalty, could not entirely erase the doubts, the fears that gnawed at her. She had seen the darkness in him, the ruthlessness he was capable of, and she wondered if he could ever truly escape the legacy of his family. They tried to rebuild their relationship, to forge a new bond based on mutual respect and understanding. They spent hours talking, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They explored the city together, rediscovering the beauty of Rome, the simple pleasures of life outside the mafia's suffocating embrace. But the tension remained, the unspoken resentments, the unresolved conflicts simmering beneath the surface. The flames of rebellion that had brought them together, that had fueled their fight for justice, had also scorched their hearts, leaving behind scars that would not easily heal. One evening, as they were walking along the Tiber River, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Alessia spoke, her voice hesitant. "Marcello," she said, do you regret it? What we did?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve.
"No," he said.
"I don't regret bringing Salvatore to justice. I don't regret choosing you. But," she asked, sensing his unspoken reservations. "But I regret the pain it caused," he said. "The pain it caused you, the pain it caused my family, the pain it caused us." Alessia nodded, her own eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said. "It was a heavy price to pay." "Was it worth it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alessia looked at him, her heart aching. She thought of her father, of his brutal murder, of the years of fear and oppression she had endured. She thought of the justice they had achieved, the lives they had saved, the darkness they had overcome. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "It was worth it. We did what was right." He smiled sadly. "But doing what's right, it doesn't always make things easy," he said.
"No," she said.
"It doesn't. But it's the only way to live. With honor, with integrity, with love." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I'm trying, Alessia," he said. "I'm trying to be a better man. For you, for myself, for our future." It was a promise, a commitment, a flicker of hope in the darkness that still lingered. The flames of rebellion had burned brightly, consuming the past, clearing the way for a new beginning. But the embers remained, glowing softly, reminding them of the sacrifices they had made, the challenges they still faced. The future was uncertain, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. The rebellion had forged a bond, tested by fire, tempered by pain, strengthened by love. Chapter 20. Redemption's Dawn. The months that followed were a testament to their resilience, their determination to build a life free from the shadows of the past. Alessia and Marcello, hand in hand, navigated the complexities of their new reality, facing the challenges, the doubts, the lingering fears, with a quiet strength, a shared commitment to a future defined by love and honesty. Marcello, dedicated to his therapy, continued to grapple with his past, to confront the demons that haunted him. He made amends, seeking forgiveness from those he had wronged, striving to atone for the sins of his family, the sins of his former self. It was a long, arduous process, but he persevered, driven by a desire for redemption, a yearning for peace. Alessia, rediscovering her passion for art, returned to her painting, her canvases filled with vibrant colors, bold strokes, images that reflected her journey, her pain, her hope. Her art became her therapy, her outlet, a way to express the emotions that words could not capture. They found solace in their shared life, in the simple routines of their days, in the quiet moments of intimacy that bound them together. They explored the hidden corners of Trastevere, discovering new cafes, new bookstores, new parks, building new memories, creating a new history. They also faced challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt and uncertainty. The legacy of the Ricci family was not easily erased. There were whispers, rumors, threats from those who still clung to the old ways, who sought revenge for Salvatore's downfall. But they faced these challenges together, their bond strengthened by adversity, their love tempered by fire. They had learned to trust each other, to rely on each other, to support each other through the darkest of times. One spring morning, Alessia woke up to the sound of birds singing, the sunlight streaming through the window. She looked at Marcello, sleeping soundly beside her, his face relaxed, his breathing even. She felt a surge of love, of gratitude, of hope. She realized that they had made it. They had survived. They had overcome the darkness, the violence, the betrayal. They had found redemption, not in the eyes of the world, but in each other's eyes. She gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He smiled at her, a slow, tender smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," she replied, her voice filled with love. They lay in silence for a moment, their bodies close, their hearts intertwined. The dawn of a new day, the dawn of a new life, the dawn of redemption. Later that day, they visited her father's grave. They stood hand in hand before the simple marble headstone, the inscription etched in the stone, Antonio DeSantis, beloved father, forever in our hearts. Alessia placed a bouquet of white roses on the grave, her tears falling silently on the flowers. She felt a sense of peace, of closure, of acceptance. Her father was gone, but his memory lived on, in her heart, in her actions, in her love for Marcelo. Marcelo put his arm around her, his presence a source of comfort, of strength. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His silence was more eloquent than any words. As they walked away from the grave, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Alessia knew that they had found their redemption. Not in the grand gestures, not in the public accolades, but in the quiet moments of love, of forgiveness, of acceptance. They had found their redemption in each other, in their shared journey, in their unwavering commitment to a future free from the darkness of the past. Redemption's dawn had broken, illuminating their path, guiding them towards a future filled with hope, with love, with peace. Epilogue. 5 years had passed. The Roman sun, the same sun that had witnessed so much violence and betrayal, now shone down on a scene of quiet contentment. Alessia and Marcelo, their hair streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, sat on the terrace of a small, charming villa overlooking the Tuscan countryside. The villa, a far cry from the opulent Ricci estate, was their sanctuary, their haven, a testament to the life they had built together, a life free from the shadows of the mafia, a life defined by love, trust, and a hard-won peace. Alessia, her easel set up before her, was painting, her brushstrokes bold and confident, capturing the vibrant colors of the rolling hills, the golden light of the setting sun. Her art, once a refuge from the darkness, was now an expression of her joy, her serenity, her profound gratitude for the life she had been given. Marcelo, sitting beside her, was reading, a book of poetry open in his hands. He had found solace in literature, in the beauty of words, in the wisdom of the ages. He had also become involved in local charities, working to help those less fortunate, striving to make amends for the sins of his past, to contribute to a better world. Their 2 children, a boy named Antonio, after Alessia's father, and a girl named Isabella, after her mother, were playing in the garden, their laughter echoing through the warm air. They were the embodiment of their love, the symbol of their hope, the promise of a future free from the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. Antonio, a spirited, mischievous boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's fiery spirit, was chasing Isabella, a gentle, thoughtful girl with her mother's artistic talent and her father's quiet strength. They were a blend of their parents, a fusion of their strengths, a testament to the enduring power of love. As Alessia watched her children play, she felt a surge of profound happiness, of overwhelming gratitude. She had found her peace, her redemption, not in the grand gestures, not in the public accolades, but in the simple joys of family, of love, of a life lived in harmony with her heart. Marcelo looked up from his book, his eyes meeting hers. He smiled, a slow, tender smile that reached all the way to his soul. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft, his gaze sweeping across the landscape, encompassing their children, their home, their life. "Yes," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "It is." They sat in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts overflowing with love. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. The air was filled with the scent of lavender and rosemary, the sound of crickets chirping, the gentle murmur of their children's voices. It was a perfect moment, a moment of grace, a moment of redemption. They had faced the darkness, conquered their demons, and emerged, scarred but not broken, their love stronger, their bond unbreakable. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the reality of their lives, in the love they shared, in the family they had created. The epilogue to their story was not an ending, but a beginning, a testament to the enduring power of hope, of forgiveness, of the human heart's capacity for love and redemption. And a full circle,